sure that's running. Anytime you want to pop up there, YouTube, cool. Great. All right. So again, the final paper is due in 2 weeks. December 5th, it's the Monday of finals, but technically we still have a class that day. The last day of all classes is that Monday, and then Tuesday is reading day, which is a Francis Marion thing, which is just a day off. And then Wednesday is when the exams actually start. So it's Wednesday, Thursday is exams, I think Friday too, and then into like Monday and Tuesday of the next week. I don't know when our exam is yet. I'm going to send an email and find out. I'll let you guys know next week because next week's our last full week. So yeah, we'll get that figured out before the final. Again, the final is just going to be in here. You'll technically have 2 hours, which is going to be the only real difference, but it's not going to be any structured any different. It's going to be on 4 chapters as opposed to 3, because we'll be able to knock out like this in the next chapter before the end. But it's not going to have any more questions than the other ones. In fact, the way I have the final structure, there's only like a few questions on the 4th chapter that you guys really need to worry about at all. So, yeah, it's not a problem. Any questions before we start? Cool, let's start and get done, and then y'all can go home. Okay. So we ended with this economic panic, which, as I said last time, was going to be the cause of some issues going forward. Let's see, is that? Yeah. Oh, right, I didn't go to the next slide because the next slide is rather complicated. We only had like 5 minutes left. Okay, so long story short, the banks did some dumb stuff, and there were some issues going on in Europe that kept hard currency from coming over here, and there was this big economic panic that lasted for like 4 years. And the end result was that people lost a lot of faith in the federal banking system, which is going to cause further issues down the road. So, another thing that's going to cause rippling effects for quite some time, and if I had been able to move things on a little further, we would have gotten to this earlier and been talking about it for probably over a month. Missouri. So, 1819, the Missouri Territory applied for statehood because, again, once they got past the Mississippi, well, not even past the Mississippi. Once they got past the Appalachians, they began divvying up the land into these large, well, tracts of land. And once their population reached a certain amount, they could apply for statehood, and then the other states would vote for it, and there would be certain laws and restrictions based on the Constitution that the state itself would put together, and blah, blah, blah. So there was this whole slavery debate because, of course, there was. The New York Congressman James Talmadge Jr. said they should ban the importation of slaves and gradually emancipate the slaves that were there before the territory could be made into a state. Because, well, Missouri was a largely agrarian state, so of course the slave owners, the planters, had already moved in. Obviously, congressmen from the South completely vetoed this because, well, they wanted more slave states. Now, the reason Missouri is this real specific case of contention is that it bordered the Northwest Territory, which had outlawed slavery from its inception, but it also bordered Kentucky and Tennessee, which were slave states. So it was in this weird, like, middle ground. I'll show you guys a map in a minute. It is in this middle area of, if we're talking about geography, it's hard to really draw a line, which they do end up drawing a line. Now, the reason that the southern states were pushing so hard for another slave state is that they needed more power in the Senate because, as we mentioned before, the Senate is controlled by the number of states. Each state has 2 representatives regardless of population because the southern states tended to have lower population even with the 3/5 compromise that made it so that slaves sort of counted towards the population so that the southern landowners would get more representation, but it still didn't catch up with the sheer number of people in the north because of all the cities and whatnot. And of course, for the sheer economics of the region, Missouri was quite good land for plantations, and as we've mentioned a couple of times, the cotton industry had been spreading throughout the country at the time. Also, there was this concern that if they outlawed slavery, which had already been instituted to some degree in Missouri, it would encourage slaves to revolt, which had been happening here and there in the previous decade. Let's see. Two rebellions had occurred in recent memory. 400 slaves in Louisiana had killed 2 whites and burned several plantations. More immediately, several hundred fugitive slaves had joined with Seminole natives in 1817, raiding Georgia plantations and establishing autonomous communities in Central Florida. So, yeah, it had been relatively recent that there had been some major uprisings. So around this time, Maine decided it was going to try to become a state because it was just sort of this, well, no, Maine wasn't part of New England. Maine was part of Massachusetts, even though it wasn't actually physically connected to Massachusetts. I don't know, it's a weird thing. But now it was going to become its own state, but since it was up north and they weren't going to have any kind of slave economy whatsoever, Southern congressmen just totally blocked its admittance for basically that reason alone. So this eventually led to Henry Clay and what became known as the Missouri Compromise. He's well known for, or he was well known, I should use the correct tense, as I told you guys when it came to writing history papers. Please use the correct tense. This is all happening in the past. Henry Clay was well known for compromising, or it sounds bad in today's political climate. He was well known for coming into tense situations and helping them work towards a middle ground, rather than just a stalemate and nothing gets done. So this not only would resolve the Missouri issue, but would hopefully also set up a solution for the future. Maine will be admitted as a free state because obviously Missouri would become a slave state. However, they would set up an official boundary line for what states could be made slave states, what states will be made free states. The southern border of Missouri was the boundary between free and slave states in the Louisiana Territory. Now, this is, let me just go ahead and put the last one up before I start walking around and talking. So this is the Missouri Compromise, and it does show how quickly any sort of slavery debate can lead to some pretty aggressive disagreement within this still very young and growing nation. Actually, I'm just going to pull up this map. So there's Missouri up here. Obviously, this unorganized and Northwest Territory, Illinois, Michigan. These all outlawed slavery, but it also technically bordered Kentucky and Tennessee. I mean, that's real technical there. But like, okay, you can have that if you want it, but the southern border of Missouri is now the line. So everything south of that, you can do slave states if you want. Everything north is going to be free states, excepting, of course, Missouri itself. Now, that meant that they only really had the Arkansas Territory to work with. But all this still existed. And we'll get to that a little bit later. I mean, actually, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to that before the end of the semester, but it's a thing that happens. Because boy howdy, once they start moving into Texas, they're like, yeah, this is south of Missouri. We can take advantage of this. Yeah, I couldn't have gotten this done in a 5-minute spiel. Okay. So this goes back to the previous slide on the Panic of 1819. Well, I mean, we'll get to it. It's one of the bullet points here. There's the train. Between 1788 and 1820, the presidency was largely Virginia elites. I mean, Washington was from there, Jefferson was from there, Adams was from there. Most of the ones we think about from this early era were all from Virginia, and they were all like wealthy landowners. And after 1800, largely Democratic Republicans, especially after 1812. So this national, the national stage seemed like there wasn't really any changing. Also, there wasn't I'm trying to think of how to put it. The regular people didn't really vote for the president. Like, you didn't go out to the polls to vote for the president. You went to the polls and voted for your, local legislature, and then they voted in the federal legislature, and then the federal legislature is what voted in the president. So, you had several degrees of separation from actually voting for the federal government. And most people wouldn't even try to vote for federal stuff because it's like, oh, well, it's already decided, so who cares? They mostly spent their political energy on local and state level stuff. And there was a lot of energetic political discourse when it came to local stuff back then. However, after 1819 and the economic disaster that was, people started seeing that, hey, the federal government is affecting all of us and we don't really have a say in it, and that's not cool. So more people wanted voting rights so that the people as a whole could have a greater voice and force politicians to actually listen to what they really cared about. So in New York State, we had Martin Van Buren pushing for getting rid of the property qualification for voting, which created male suffrage for white men, at least. So as long as you were a man in New York State and you were white, you could vote. Now, boy, this was real specific, because if you were a woman, or you were Native American, or you were black, boy, you were very excluded. We had talked about all the different states that didn't technically exclude these other groups, or like the many times we talked about New Jersey, which we'll get to that in just a minute. Oh yeah, here we go. With this expanded suffrage for white men, at least, they started tying up these loopholes. New Jersey had the single or widowed landowning women had the right to vote until 1807, along with, as we mentioned, free black men, as long as they own some amount of property. But then these small numbers of women and free black men could actually affect local votes, local elections, and they're like, oh wait, we can't have this. We can't have these people actually affecting the vote, so they closed that loophole. Meanwhile, in New York State, as we mentioned earlier, they got rid of the property qualifications for white men, but they raised the property qualifications for African American men, which largely disenfranchised the vast majority of them, because you do not come into generational wealth as an African American in the 1800s. You start out at the very bottom and you have very few rights, if any, and that's assuming you're even free, and then you do your best from there, and then you now have to own like a certain amount of land in order to vote at all. Yeah, it was very much a rigged system. Now, that said, when the African Americans protested this, some whites actually did side with them, not necessarily because they were sympathetic, but because they realized, hey, wait, if you're denying them rights based on the fact that they're a certain race, that sets a real bad precedent, because if you can do that, you can be like, okay, well, also if you're descended from the Irish, you can't vote, or if you're descended from, Germans, you can't vote, or if you're not the right kind of Protestant, you can't vote. This sets a real bad precedent. But the people who were for this made some very specific arguments, saying that, but if we let black men vote, they might elect black legislatures, and there might be interracial mingling and maybe even interracial marriage. Dun dun dun. Which some people still think is a bad thing in modern day, current year 2022. It's weird living in the 1800s. However, apparently these arguments worked back then, and by 1840, 93% of free blacks were disenfranchised. So, yay, progress. 1 step forward and 3 steps back. So yeah, the expanding voting rights, I should have put like a big old asterisk up there next to it. So when I say expanding voting rights, it means specifically for white men and nobody else. In fact, diminishing voting rights for everybody else. Abigail Adams must have been dead by now, because I think she would have stabbed somebody over this. So here we have, this would be New Jersey, back before women couldn't vote. I like the one there in the middle. Where's my mouse? One there in the middle, like just giving that guy this, I can and will stab you look. I've got an aunt that gives that look very well. She also kind of looks like that woman. Probably not the best segue, but on the topic of racism, more restrictions, because you couldn't just like take away the right to vote. You had to do more awful things, because I mean, it's America after all. Let's see. So, Congress limited naturalization to immigrants. So, hey, if you came from outside the country, like Germany or Italy or Ireland, you could apply for citizenship and eventually become an American citizen. But if you were a freed slave, or the next generation of freed slave, you couldn't be a citizen. And like making it so they couldn't be citizens stripped them of a lot of rights. That's a thing we'll see next semester with the Chinese. A lot. Also excluded blacks from joining federal militias. DC and state governments were encouraged to adopt separate legal codes when it came to free blacks and slaves. Not separate between free blacks and slaves, but separate codes when it came to how you prosecute white people and how you prosecute non-white people, because again, 1800s America, or America. Segregation of public schools, public transportation, public places like churches and theaters, which didn't go away until like the 1950s, 60s. South Africa held on to it until like the 80s or 90s. It's called apartheid. And they're still real racist in South Africa. Obviously, they also faced mob and state-sanctioned violence. Divark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina, faced unfounded accusations of following Toussaint Louverture, which, if you don't remember, because you probably should, he was the head of the Haiti Rebellion. So there was this rumor that he was following the Haiti Rebellion and was going to cause a rebellion in Charleston. That, of course, never happened. He was just a free black in Charleston who organized churches, mutual aid societies, and other black institutions. But, that was seen as being dangerous. So Vesey and 34 of his alleged co-conspirators, or I guess dudes that he worked with, were hanged, and 18 others were exiled from Charleston, probably from South Carolina entirely. And also, because they can't just be done with murdering people, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where supposedly they were planning this insurrection, was also torn down because, you know, you can't just do anything halfway. Now, this wasn't just a southern thing. There were race riots in the north. The large one in Cincinnati. Half of its black residents fled to Ontario, Canada to resettle. They also fled from Philadelphia in 1832 after a similar attack. And this continued throughout the 1830s. Now again, we'll get more into this next semester with like Red Summer, I think it was called. It's sadly a yet another bit of history that's going to be repeated multiple times. So here's Denmark Vesey. And here's Cincinnati, where they're just like burning down the tenements where the African Americans are living. What's up? Well, there was racism all over the country, regardless. In the South, where there were some, free black men, they were treated as like fugitives almost. Like, oh, you're not a slave, you must be up to something. And a lot of them did flee up north, but they were seen as like unwanted groups, and eventually it would lead to just violence, just like any kind of immigrant group. But as we saw, just up here at the top, a lot of them weren't even allowed to become citizens, so they didn't actually have legal protections. So yeah, it wasn't that the North was like this enlightened society that welcomed everybody. They just weren't engaging in slavery, but they were still certainly engaging in racism. So these civil restrictions actually followed the decline of the Federalists. The Federalists had largely been pushing the abolition laws because, again, they're more politically aligned with the British, and the British had been getting rid of slavery for the most part across their empire for quite some time. Again, South Africa is a weird case. But with the Federalists losing their power, this federal push for abolition went away. Now, the Democratic Republicans, who now were really the only game in town, themselves began struggling over the same issue that caused the split between the Federalists in the first place, and that was federal power. You can tell from the name. So the Democratic Republicans had been basically unopposed for like 25 years. And a lot of the party had moved towards a broader interpretation of federal laws, a greater use of federal power. Others wanted to return to this Jeffersonian ideal of limited federal power, which is funny because we just talked about how Jefferson used federal power a lot. not just the Louisiana Purchase, which again I don't blame him for. When you get that kind of deal, it's like, yeah, you got to take it. But the stuff with like the embargoes and the force acts to stop smuggling, it's like, yeah, this feels very Revolutionary War. So, yeah, I like that it's like Jeffersonian principles, not necessarily what he actually did. So, in the 1824 election, things had begun to split, and by 1828, they had actually split into two distinct parties. We'll get into that here in just a second. So in 1824, again, it was technically one party, Democratic Republicans, but there were four separate camps. There was John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, who was Monroe's Secretary of War. Don't worry about Crawford, he gets like 2 votes. So Adams and Jackson were really the two to keep an eye on. Jackson technically won. He got the popular vote, and he had Martin Van Buren backing him up, which was a lot of power, to be honest. However, because none of them won the majority, it went to the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay threw his support in behind Adams. But because it was so close, Adams could only do so much with the power that he had. Congress was run by Van Buren, who again was a supporter of Andrew Jackson. And his own vice president, Calhoun, opposed what Adams did. Again, we've got this like, oh, well, if you have a presidential candidate that does this, then you need a vice presidential candidate that does like this other stuff. So you've got a broad ticket, which is a decent idea, but then you've got these two dudes that hate each other, and they don't work too well. So they weren't able to continue improvements with federal money due to this internal opposition. Again, internal improvements means like federal roads and canals and all of that good stuff. Now, the few things John Quincy Adams did do, he's known for a few things. One, he's known because he's John Adams' son. He's John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. Also, he extended a tariff from 1816 for more expensive goods. And then in 1828, he had a tariff for raw materials like hemp, wool, and molasses. Now, the thing about tariffs, this, again, a big thing back then, it was depending on who you were and where you were and what the tariffs were on, it could help or hurt your business. Typically, the merchants in the Northeast liked tariffs because it raised prices and meant that they could sell their goods for cheaper than outside. A tariff affects external imports. So, something from France or Britain would cost more than something made here in the States. But that also means that those countries are usually going to respond with their own tariff. So if you're trying to trade with that country, say you're a southern landowner and you're trying to ship out cotton or wheat or whatever, they're going to put a tariff on that, so it's going to be harder for you to sell in that country. So for a northern merchant, it's usually good. For a southern planter, it's usually bad. But apparently these specific tariffs Jackson saw as being good for frontier farmers, so he supported them, which was weird for him, but we'll get to that. See, it was a real weird race. Jackson technically won, but then Clay threw his support in behind him. Oh, Crawford actually did better than Clay. Crawford doesn't matter. But then if you add Clay's votes into Adams, Adams beat Jackson. So it's a whole thing. Whoops, did I bump my mic? Say all this to say that the Democratic-Republican Party is splitting, and John Quincy Adams was really the last president of the Democratic-Republican Party because it was fractured, and by the next election it was completely two separate parties. So let's get to the more important election, 1828. So, with 1828 coming up, and Adams only really having the 1828 tariff as something that he did that people liked, he decided he would do the traditional standing for office, which in his words, "My country wants my services, she must ask for them." In other words, you don't campaign. You're like, hey, I was president, you know what I did, pick me if you want me to be president again. Jackson did not do that. So with Martin Van Buren, he engaged in an aggressive run for office, which, is all people do nowadays for like years leading up to elections. It's so freaking annoying. Created the first truly national campaign, tried to recreate the coalition that created the Democratic-Republican Party to begin with, which again will kind of come back to haunt them, but it works to begin with. I'll get to that in a little bit. So, he's joined by John C. Calhoun as a running mate. Though they disagreed on tariffs, which will come back to haunt him, Calhoun's from South Carolina and Jackson's from Tennessee. We're basically neighbors. They got along well enough. They organized newspaper campaigns, created a logo based on his nickname from his war days of Old Hickory. And by war hero days, I mean war crime days. We'll talk about his war crimes in a little bit. He had a reputation as a native fighter, aka genocide, native from Tennessee. He also rose to wealth rather than being born into wealth. So he has support among lots of groups from the frontier to the south, and then also he supported the 1828 tariff. So he actually had a little bit of support in the Northeast as well. Not a great deal of support, but they didn't completely oppose him. Okay, don't do this. Don't do this again, come on. So supporters launched personal attacks against Jackson. They attacked his wife, Rachel, said her divorce from her previous husband was really quite close to her marriage with Jackson. I actually got this mixed up with the Jefferson Adams run before. Yeah, this is where the supporters of Adams really aggressively went after Jackson's family. Now Adams kept his hands clean by just not getting involved. He wanted to put on the appearance of a gentlemanly statesman while letting his supporters do all the dirty work. But he wasn't technically supporting them, but he certainly wasn't telling them to stop. Regardless of all this, though, Jackson won substantially. I'll show you guys the map in just a minute. So it was during this campaign that Jackson and his supporters began calling themselves the Democracy, while Adams' supporters named themselves the National Republicans. And this is where the official split happened. So we've got the Democrats and the National Republicans, which is different on the scale in terms of liberal and conservative than it is today, but that doesn't happen until like post FDR. So we won't get into that this semester. And here's some fun ads about Jefferson. Some account of the bloody deeds of General Jackson, and these are basically not just it's actually not talking about all the natives he killed, but like the men under his command that died, often due to Jackson. You need to stop doing this. So yeah, that's fun. Election of 1828. Yeah, as you can see, Jackson won really hard. I mean, now, granted, the percentage of the map doesn't really matter, because as you can see from the numbers there, like everything south of Virginia, we've got very few representative votes. And then you get up to like New York, it's got 36. But New York was split. Jackson had 20, Adams had 16. So he still got quite a chunk out of that. This is a fun image. We'll actually get to this in just a minute. It's this rise to despotism. Nullification, South Carolina Ordinance, we'll talk about. We causing more trouble, can you imagine? Well, I say more trouble. This was before the Civil War, so we were causing trouble before then. Treason, Civil War, we almost got there. Deception, disunion, and then finally despotism. Yeah, they thought Jackson was going to take over or whatever. Okay. So, during Jackson's inauguration, March 4th, 1829, prior to the Civil War, the inauguration was in March, just FYI. Ordinary folks poured into Jackson's inauguration to see Jackson himself. Up until this point, inaugurations were real boring. I mean, they're still real boring. But they were just like dignitaries and, political officials and representatives and congressmen and all that crap would be there. However, regular folks showed up to D.C. because they wanted to see Jackson. Actually, still Washington City. No, wait, it was D.C. now because it got burned in 1812. Anyway, so let me read here. Vast throngs of supporters waved and cheered. Wealthy planters were jammed shoulder to shoulder with frontier farmers and working men and women. Local African Americans also turned out for the spectacle. The size and enthusiasm of the crowd soon shattered the decorum of the inauguration. Arthur Margaret Bayard Smith reported mobs scrambling, fighting, and romping through the White House reception. Jackson was nearly crushed to death by a rabble eager to shake his hand. Tubs of punch laced with rum, brandy, and champagne were finally placed on the lawn to draw crowds outdoors. So while Jackson's supporters saw this enthusiasm being a good thing and being symbolic of the democratic spirit, more conservative leaders saw this being dangerous. Again, Bayard Smith warned against putting too much faith in the hands of the people who, quote, have been found in all ages and countries where they get their power in their hands. Let me see. Where they get power in their hands, that of all tyrants, they are the most ferocious, cruel, and despotic. Again, they were concerned about having another French Revolution. Not long after Jackson took power, we had the so-called Petticoat Affair. Long story short, there was a scandal with the Tennessee Senator John Eaton, who Jackson appointed as Secretary of War. Let's see. Eaton had an affair with a woman who he thought to be of questionable character and later married her. So, like, when he came to Washington with his wife, the other, like, political ladies scorned her and treated her really poorly and basically forced Eaton out of office. I don't know, it's 1800s politics. Oh, never mind. I got ahead of myself once again. This actually caused so much scandal in Jackson's presidency that it pressured the rest of his cabinet to resign, so the National Republicans gained more momentum in Congress, which again is like, I don't understand. Because it just says here, the Petticoat Affair also led to Jackson's entire cabinet to resign, after which the legislative agenda stalled in Congress. National Republicans regained momentum. But it doesn't say, like, why the rest of the cabinet resigned. I don't know. Now, there was this concern. It doesn't say that this is why, but there was this concern that Jackson was using his authority to reward his friends, because this was just a senator from Tennessee who Jackson knew because he was also a political operator from Tennessee. So rather than let me make this guy Secretary of War because he knows how to do things, it's I'm going to give this guy a really fancy office because he's a dude I know, and maybe he helped me out in the past. He also used an informal group of advisors known as the Kitchen Cabinet rather than his official cabinet because Jackson couldn't be bothered with official stuff. So selecting personal friends for positions of power, which was continued by future administrations, for better or worse, usually worse, became known as a spoils system. That's from, old war stuff. If you win a victory, win a battle, you take a city or whatever, it's spoils, which is to say the loot inside is your right by victory. So technically, since Jackson won the presidency, he had the right to appoint whoever. There wasn't a law against it. It's just that back then they could be like, hey, you just gave this guy the position because he's a friend of yours and he's not actually good at his job. And then the dude felt something called shame and actually like left that job. I don't know, it was weird. So here's the people partying at Jackson's inauguration. You got a couple of, like, sleighs there? I guess there was still snow on the ground. It looks like there's still snow on the ground. Somebody brought their mouse. Somebody brought the little dog, which might not be safe if Jackson himself almost got trampled. This is John Eaton and his wife. Some dudes fighting over there. Jackson's kitchen cabinet. All right, let's get a little further while I can, because we need to get as much Jackson stuff done as we can today. So, as I said earlier, Jackson trying to brand together all these different groups that had differing ideas. While it looks good on paper, once they're sitting together trying to get stuff done, these differing ideas are going to clash. And one of the ways they clashed was over tariffs. So, one of the main things was that 1828 tariff that Jackson technically had supported, and that's what got him the support that he got in the North. However, Southern planters and politicians expected him to repeal it because they just don't want any tariffs at all. So, this led to almost civil war. Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, again, South Carolina native, anonymously wrote in the South Carolina Exposition in protest, although I don't know how anonymous it was because it seems like they knew it was him kind of right away. Basically said that states have the ultimate power in deciding the constitutionality of laws. This stance was known as nullification or ignoring federal law. It's just that a state's like, hey, this federal law, I don't like it. We're just going to not do that. Now, in a case-by-case basis, it feels like, okay, well, the North wants the tariffs and the South doesn't, so why don't we just use the tariff in the North and not in the South? Well, for one, you can't do that on a national level. But also, if a state decides, we don't feel like listening to a federal law, then what's the point of having federal laws? Because that just means that if this was allowed, if Jackson was like, okay, well, we'll just let you guys get away with it, then every other state in the country will now no longer be beholden to any federal laws at all. If they passed a law that was like, hey, you guys need to, in modern day, hey, federal seatbelt laws, don't launch yourself out windows, it's kind of bad. And every state's like, we don't feel like passing that. Nothing the federal government can do. We go right back to the Articles of Confederation. The federal government has no power. So South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne defended this stance in 1830. He said that it would be used to economically crush the South, despite the South being like the major source of cotton, which was 2/3 of the economy at the time. Daniel Webster, of course, opposed nullification. And then Jackson supported Webster's opposition of nullification. So Jackson was against South Carolina getting its way, despite Jackson being one of the like states' rights guys. So while this is going on, Jackson signed the 1832 tariff into law. South Carolina held a convention that approved this ordinance of nullification and prepared for armed conflict. They were ready to go to war over this thing. I say they, we, South Carolina. However, that never manifested. I don't think Jackson ever even like got militias together to go intimidate South Carolina. They ended up backing down, but this was very nearly the Civil War 30 years early over tariffs. However, Jackson was dealing with other stuff at the time. The Bank of the United States had to be rechartered, and Jackson's opponents were expecting him to veto it, which would split the party because, once again, certain groups did like the Bank of the United States, others did not, especially after the 1819 panic. So the bank has stabilized the U.S. economy during the 1820s. Merchants, bankers, entrepreneurs, etc. Were behind it, but regular citizens disliked it. It demanded specie payments, which again, that's hard gold and silver, not paper money. And regular folk weren't real big on that. So Jackson did what his opponents thought he would do and vetoed the charter for the second, well, I guess it ended up being the third bank of the United States. But people across the United States actually supported him on it, saying that the bank was, quote, dangerous to the liberties of the people. We almost had a civil war in the 1830s, and they're like, oh, the bank is dangerous to the people. Like, my dude. All right, whatever. Here's Andrew Jackson talking about nullification, power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state, incompatible with the existence of the Union. Because, yeah, if one state's like, I just don't feel like following these laws, it's like, then what's the point of the Union at all? Contradicted by the Constitution, authorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle on which it was founded, destructive to the great object for which it was formed, etc. So, yeah. It was very close to being a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal, but it was almost a bigger deal. Also, when I was looking at the nullification crisis, I found this image, and it's real dumb, but I had to use it. Yeah, that's about where we were. And then also, they were like, oh, this was actually the, this actually isn't the nullification crisis. This is the bank veto. Like, oh, Andrew Jackson's going to veto the bank, and he's this making himself a king. It's like, yo, one of the only things the president does is either sign laws or sign bills into law or veto them. Like, that's their main job. And because he's doing one, not the other, suddenly he's this tyrant. Chill out. And everyone was already expecting him to do it anyway. So, like, they're being very dramatic here. Not that I'm supporting Andrew Jackson, because he's an asshole. But in that particular instance, it's like everybody was expecting him to veto it anyway. I'm not real strong one way or the other on the whole Bank of America, the whole Bank of the United States thing. They probably should have kept it, but at the time, the climate was not to keep a bank. There's this great image here. There would be a great image there. Okay. For some reason, the one in the book is in color. I couldn't find it in color online, or at least I couldn't find it in color online that was not pixelated horribly. There's Andrew Jackson fighting the bank, the many-headed monster. Many-headed beast would have been less horribly alliterated. But, yeah, so every head on there is like a specific banker or like a congressman supporting the banks. It's a very, very specific political cartoon there. I do like that some of them have hats. Okay, one more thing with Jackson. Actually, we can finish the chapter. Let's finish the chapter. Indian removal, because obviously. One way Jackson got support of the South was by kicking out the natives so that they could take their land. Now, some folks within Jackson's administration weren't real big on this, because his policy was either we force them further west or we wipe them out. And both are technically genocide. Like if you take an entire group of people based on their ethnicity or religion or whatever and force them to move from a region, that's ethnic cleansing. That's genocide. Also wiping them out for that same reason. Jackson did both. Those that were against this move were Protestant missionaries who wanted to civilize the natives, which is to say convert them to their religion. James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, supported the rights of the natives. Are you going to come back on? Okay. To maintain their land if they worked with the missionaries. Jackson worked with the politicians who wanted to force the natives west, because obviously he did. The Cherokee Nation is one we're going to talk about, not just this chapter, but the next chapter. They worked with Jackson against the Creek natives at Horseshoe Bend, and realized that the best way to fight the Western societies were to adopt Western governments. So under John Ross, they actually did adopt a Republican form of government. So they declared themselves a sovereign nation. Georgia legislature, of course, rejected this, saying that they were under the jurisdiction of the state. There was a little bit more back and forth than just the back and forth between Georgia and the Cherokee, but we're moving on. 1830, Jackson pushed Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. Now, again, if you just look at the letter of these acts, it seems fair. It's like, okay, well, we need the lands here, so we'll give you land across the Mississippi and then everything will be fine. They're having to give up land that they've lived on for generations, that they know how to work, that they know is good land, for mystery land out west that may or may not be, that will not be, fertile and worth living on, or even capable of surviving on, and will actually be much less land than was promised. But again, the Cherokee Nation largely worked to try to keep their territory. Meanwhile, Jackson sent federal troops up to Illinois to move the Sauk and Fox natives. Chief Black Hawk and his warriors were killed at Bad Axe. The Seminole natives, they were not going anywhere either. So they were down in Florida preparing for battle, and John Ross continued to use the legal system to try to keep the Cherokee where they were. So real quick, here's John Ross. Here's the plan for the Indian Removal Act. Now, as you can see, that's Oklahoma. However, the land ended up being this corner up here. Yeah. Here's the Battle of Bad Axe, which is a steamboat with a cannon on front against a bunch of dudes on a barge. As you can imagine, didn't go especially well. Here's the Americans murdering a bunch of Seminole. We'll get to that next chapter. Conclusion real quick, because we're almost done. War of 1812 wasn't just dangerous because, you know, the English burned down the capital, but there were groups within America that actually opposed the war and were pushing for secession. Panic of 1819 happened. Concerns over banks and tariffs. The admission of Missouri highlighted the struggle over slavery. Henry Clay not only did the Missouri Compromise, but he also was working with John Ross to try to help him maintain his land, or the Cherokee's land. John Quincy Adams, Democrat-Republican Party split, and then we had Andrew Jackson, who will lead us into the next chapter. So I'll see y'all next Monday. Please show up next week. We got a lot to finish. that should be it. We won't be meeting Wednesday because Thanksgiving. I'll see you guys next Monday, and we'll do the next chapter Monday and Wednesday, and then the following Monday it'll be our last day. So, yeah, see you guys then. Bye.